On April 9th, the Honorable Ross A. Walters, United States Magistrate Judge for the Southern District of Iowa, presided over a luncheon sponsored by the Polk County Bar Association to recall three important historical events that took place 150 years ago in 1863: the Emancipation Proclamation, the Battle at Gettysburg, and the Gettysburg Address. Here now is the Honorable Ross A. Walters.
You might ask what qualifies me to talk about the Emancipation Proclamation, the Battle of Gettysburg, and things like that. I was long ago, 1970, 1971, a seasonal park ranger at the Gettysburg National Military Park. I wore a Smokey the Bear hat and the costume and everything. I gave demonstrations on how to fire a Civil War rifle. We did talks all over the battlefield and those kinds of things. And I grew up in Pennsylvania. We'd gone down to Gettysburg a time or two, but being there and learning about it, it's always been a great interest to me. And frankly, every time I get back to Pennsylvania, I try to spend a day at the battlefield. And it moved me then, and it still moves me today. So I'm happy to talk about it, as well as the Emancipation Proclamation. When they asked me to talk about the Emancipation Proclamation, they said I could also talk about the Battle of Gettysburg and the Gettysburg Address. I'm going to address all those things, hopefully within a decent period of time. Now, all these things happened 150 years ago this year, and they're all very important, and it's good to recall them now because 1863 was a year that changed our country forever. Now, some attribution, I don't know all this. I know some of it, and the stuff I remember from Gettysburg is probably half right, maybe a little bit more than that. So I did do a little research. Of course, Doris Kearns Goodwin's a great book, Team of Rivals, Philip Conard Jr.'s New Birth of Freedom, Gary Wills' Lincoln at Gettysburg, and then my own recollection, which I'm sure is more or less served the test of time. And anyway, let's talk about the origins of the Civil War, and I'm going to start with the Dred Scott decision in 1857, which really ripped things and set up the Civil War. The holding, of course, the opinion was written by Chief Justice Taney, and there are two holdings. The first one is that black Americans, free or slaves, are not citizens and cannot sue in federal court. In fact, in very racist terms, the Supreme Court said, Justice Taney said that, I'm paraphrasing, that black people have no rights that white persons are bound to respect. It was that blunt and awful. In dicta, the court, and it was dicta because it wasn't necessary to the holding once they found there was no jurisdiction, the court went on to hold that the federal government had no power to regulate slavery in any territory. Well, that's what ripped it, because you may recall that by saying, they're basically saying Congress had no power to stitch together all the compromises which had held the Union together as the dispute about slavery fostered and festered, I should say. Interestingly, Justice Taney thought his decision would settle the slavery question by transforming a political issue into settled law. Well, it had quite the opposite effect, as we now know. In fact, he wrote that he had an abiding confidence that this act of my judicial life will stand the test of time and the sober judgment of the country. Boy, nothing could have ever been more wrong. It's just the opposite. Of course, this got the abolitionists up north in a fury. And of course, the more they got in a fury, the more the people in the South feared what would happen if a Northerner ever became President of the United States, which is exactly what happened in the election of 1860. It was a very fractured election. There were four presidential candidates. Abraham Lincoln won with 39.8% of the vote. The Republican candidate, John Breckinridge, the Southern Democrat, had 18.1% of the vote. John Bell, Constitutional Union Party, had 12.6%. Stephen A. Douglas, the Democrat, had 29.5%, but fewer electoral votes, interestingly, than anybody else. Lincoln got the most electoral votes, and he was elected. Throughout the campaign, and in fact leading up to it in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, Lincoln had always said he had no intention of ever attempting to abolish slavery where it existed. He was opposed to slavery, but his main political point of view was that he would oppose it being extended into the territories. The Southerners, of course, didn't trust him. With all the build-up through everything that had happened, they decided to start seceding. As President James Buchanan, Pennsylvania's only president, I'm sorry to say, looked on helplessly and did nothing. President Buchanan was a lawyer and was a little overly legalistic about it. He thought secession was illegal, but that it was illegal to try to stop it by force of arms. So he was frozen and let it happen. So when Lincoln enters office, most of the southern states have seceded, and the war starts shortly after that. Now, Lincoln has to be very careful about what the war is about. why he is calling for volunteers. He makes the point over and over, it is only to preserve the Union, it is not to abolish slavery. And he has to take that position because to abolish slavery would drive the border states, Missouri, Kentucky, Tennessee, Maryland, and Delaware, all slaveholding states, out of the Union. That was his concern. And in the end, all those states except Tennessee stayed in the Union. But he had to be very careful to not make the war a war against slavery. Maryland was a particular problem because if Maryland left the Union, Washington, D.C. would be surrounded. And as you probably know, or you might recall, Union troops, volunteers, had been attacked by mobs as they marched through Baltimore. The legislature had been summoned by the governor to consider secession. Lincoln prevents it, the legislature, from meeting and doing that. He suspends habeas corpus, in re Merriman, and all that stuff. So it's a very tense time as to who's going to secede and who not, and of course Maryland is the key. There's another practical reason why Lincoln cannot articulate that the war is about slavery, and that's because many in the North will fight for the Union, but they will not fight to end slavery, particularly the so-called Union Democrats, and Lincoln knows this. But as you can't, slavery's everywhere. You cannot keep the cork in the bottle. Union generals like Ben Butler early in the year down occupying New Orleans, he started to seize slaves and free them as contraband. Well, there are two problems with that. First of all, it did recognize the slaves as property. Second of all, by seizing things as under the Articles of War as contraband, Butler was in effect recognizing the Confederacy as having the rights of a nation at war, and there were rebels. Lincoln was completely opposed to that, so he had to deal with Ben Butler. Other Union generals in areas under their control would issue general orders freeing the slaves. Well, that was counterproductive. That would get the border states agitated, get the Union Democrats agitated, and Lincoln had to busy himself rescinding those orders where they were issued. Of course, abolitionists in Congress were constantly after him to make the end of slavery an express goal of the war. And then there was the legal issue. Slaves were property. They were expressly recognized as such in the very Constitution that Lincoln was seeking to preserve. Congress itself did some sort of fitful nibbles at slavery. They passed two confiscation acts which purported to emancipate slaves held by persons, quote, engaged in rebellion. But the problem was, how do you identify individuals in the South who are engaged in rebellion and those are not? And the result is some have slaves and some don't. It was unenforceable, really. Congress did outlaw slavery in the territories, but of course that was in direct contravention of the holding of the Supreme Court in the Dred Scott case. Congress passed a law agreeing to compensate owners who voluntarily freed their slaves, but not surprisingly, the slave owners in the southern states did not flock to take advantage of that particular opportunity. Slaves were, however, freed in the District of Columbia, but with compensation. So it's dealt with, nibbled at legislatively. But the pot continues to boil. Now, Lincoln himself was personally strongly opposed to slavery, but again, his laser-like focus was on preserving the Union. So the question really in his mind became how to both free the slaves while preserving the Union. In the spring of 1862, Lincoln raised with his cabinet the idea of promoting voluntarily freeing the slaves in the border states. The idea was there would be compensation, the freedom would be staged, and after all, he told his cabinet, the expense of 1/2 day of the war would buy all the slaves then in Delaware. But Lincoln's cabinet is strongly opposed. Oh no, the old arguments, emancipation will lengthen the war, it'll consolidate the rebellion, it'll drive the border states out, so Lincoln abandons that idea. But then an idea starts to form in Lincoln's mind. He's continuing to get reports from his generals that slaves are being employed in many ways which sustain the Confederacy as cooks, hospital workers, teamsters, fields hands, tasks that allow the white populace to go away and fight the Union armies. Lincoln starts to think in his mind about the idea of freeing the slaves in the states of rebellion as a war measure under his powers as commander-in-chief. Now that has several advantages as he thinks about it. First, by freeing only the slaves in the rebel states, slavery in the border states would be at least legally kept intact. So you didn't have to worry about the border states as much. Secondly, unlike with the Confiscation Acts, it would be clear what slaves are freed. It would be the slaves in the states in rebellion. But the best advantage of all was Lincoln could do it all on his own as commander-in-chief. In July 1862, Lincoln reveals his thinking to his cabinet. He calls a special meeting of the cabinet, and in those days the cabinet was really a deliberative body. I mean, it's what the president relied on for advice. He reads to them a preliminary draft of the Emancipation Proclamation. He tells his cabinet that he welcomes their suggestions, but he has made up his mind, he has resolved to do this. He proposes to give the states in rebellion until January 1, 1863 to rejoin the Union. Otherwise, the slaves in those states will be freed as a war measure. Now, Lincoln's cabinet is thunderstruck. Postmaster General Montgomery Blair, who's from Maryland, says it will drive the border states out of the Union. Treasury Secretary Salmon P. Chase, who is an abolitionist, fears disorder and massacre throughout the South. Secretary of State Seward worries about a racial war and what Britain and France will, he's thinking that they might end up recognizing the Confederacy, which the Confederacy dearly wants, or intervene to protect their economic interests, cotton. But in the end, the cabinet gets behind Lincoln, but Lincoln does agree to one of Secretary Seward's suggestions, and that is he will withhold his proclamation until there's a Union victory. Otherwise, said Seward, it would seem like a desperate act. Well, waiting for a Union victory takes some time because they haven't been doing all that well. In the meantime, in August 1862, Lincoln hosts a delegation of former slaves to the White House, and he sounds them out about the idea of colonization. And this is something that Lincoln and others had toyed with. You know, the issue, in fact, the reason we have, well, the whole extent of the civil rights movement is because the issue of what happens after slavery is something the country has struggled with over time. But he wants to, the idea of colonization was, well, the freed slaves would voluntarily agree to go somewhere else, someplace in Central America or over in Africa somewhere, and he sounds these freed slaves out on it, then they'll have none of it. And they tell him, you know, our ancestors were brought here by force, not voluntarily, but this is our home now. And we do not want to leave. This is not a solution. And Lincoln comes off that idea eventually as well. The New York Tribune's Horace Greeley gets word of these discussions, and he publishes a scathing open letter to Lincoln called The Prayers of 20 Million. Greeley accuses Lincoln of being influenced by, quote, fossil politicians in the border slave states. And in this instance, Lincoln decides to respond. He writes an open letter to Greeley in which he says this, and this aptly sums up Lincoln's view. As to the policy I seem to be pursuing, as you say, I have not meant to leave anyone in doubt. My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. What I do about slavery, I do because it helps to save the Union. And what I forbear because I do not believe it would help to save the Union. I shall do less whenever I shall believe that what I'm doing hurts the cause, and I'll do more whenever I shall believe doing more will help the cause. Of course, what Horace Greeley does not know is that Lincoln has already decided to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. Well, lo and behold, a Union victory comes along, at least that's what they're able to call it. In September of 1862, Lee invades Maryland. General McClellan, the Army of the Potomac, turn him back at Antietam. It's a tactical victory. Lincoln decides to issue the preliminary proclamation. He does so on September 22nd, 1862. Lincoln states that all persons held as slaves in any state or any designated part of a state then in rebellion will quote, will be thenceforward and forever free. Lincoln says that on January 1, 1863, he will by proclamation designate the states or parts of the states then in rebellion whose slaves will then be freed. Now this comes as a surprise to the populace, though not the cabinet. It is a seismic development. There's all kinds of turmoil, pro and con in the media and gatherings and protests and so forth. But many wonder, will Lincoln really have the fortitude to do this on January 1, 1863? Will he really do it? The great Frederick Douglass, who had been highly critical of Lincoln on the subject of slavery and his war policy, wrote in his monthly publication. He said, "We shout for joy that we live to record this righteous decree." But then he answers the doubters. Abraham Lincoln will take no step backward. Abraham Lincoln may be slow, but Abraham Lincoln is not the man to reconsider, retract, and contradict words and purposes solemnly proclaimed over his official signature. If he has taught us to confide in nothing else, he has taught us to confide in his word. Lincoln tells a congressman about the same time. My word is out to these people. I cannot take it back. January 1, 1863 comes. None of the Confederate states have returned, of course. And believe it or not, in many places, crowds gather, particularly in the North, in New York and elsewhere, around the telegraph office, waiting to hear word if Lincoln has actually freed the slaves. Well, they'll have to wait. You know, I don't know, it happens with rulings that I write and everything else. The Emancipation Proclamation is all prepared. It's brought over that morning by Secretary Seward. It's got written out in longhand, Seward, and they look at it. There's a mistake in it. I don't know what the mistake was. But it has to go back and have somebody rewrite the whole thing. Well, it's New Year's Day, and Lincoln is obliged to attend the annual White House New Year's Day reception for the diplomatic corps, high government officials, and later the general public. In those days, you could wander into the White House and shake the president's hand, ask him how he was doing, make a special request, and all that stuff. Lincoln had to endure that. He shook hands for 3 full hours, and he finally, about 2 p.m., was able to escape to his office. He's met by Secretary Seward and his son with a corrected Emancipation Proclamation. They roll it out for Lincoln to sign. Lincoln picks up a pen, he dips it in ink, but then he hesitates. He puts the pen down. His hand is shaking from having himself shaken so many hands. Lincoln tells Seward, "I never in my life felt more certain that I was doing right than I do in signing this paper. If my hand trembles as I sign, all will say, 'He hesitated.'" So he waits, gets the shakes out of his hands, slowly picks up the pen, and boldly signs the signature. The deed is done. The crowds in New York, who are getting a little late in the day, were worried. All of a sudden it comes over the telegraph line. The proclamation has been signed. Now, in the interest of time, I'm not going to read it to you. You'll be very happy to know. But what it does is it frees all of the slaves in rebellion in the states which are Arkansas, Texas, Louisiana, except for down around New Orleans. That's been in Union control all along, and those parishes around there were not considered to be actively in rebellion. Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, except the 48 counties who were then forming themselves as West Virginia. And also in Virginia, there was, the Norfolk area was controlled by the Union. They were accepted as well. Interestingly, he does not include Tennessee as a state then in rebellion. Though Tennessee has seceded, it has been occupied by Union forces since the beginning of the war and has a Union military governor, so they don't consider it as having been in rebellion. The Emancipation Proclamation asks those who are free to abstain from acts of violence. And then there's something else in the Emancipation Proclamation. And this really gets attention. "And I further declare and make it known that such persons of suitable condition will be received into the armed service of the United States to garrison forts, positions, stations, and other places, and to man vessels of all sorts in said service. And 200,000 African Americans, many of them ex-slaves, volunteer to serve in the Union Army during the remainder of the Civil War." So the word is out. Now, is it really, you know, the Gordian knot of slavery has really been cut. Some are happy, some are angry, but the boil has been lanced. Now, it's just a war measure, mind you, but everybody knows what the Emancipation Proclamation means. The Confederates, the abolitionists, the radical Republicans, the border state slaveholders, the Democrats, both Copperhead and Union, especially the slaves and former slaves. Ending slavery and preserving the Union are now one and the same cause. After the Emancipation, liberty and union is the Union cry. No one really expects that the Emancipation Proclamation is just a war measure. I mean, think of it. After the Union, is it really to be expected that slavery will go on just as before, happily in the border states, and there'll be no slaves anywhere else in the country? It's impossible. And in fact, by the end of the war, all of the border states on their own outlaw slavery, except for Kentucky and Delaware. And the 13th Amendment did that in those states. Some ridicule the proclamation. Lincoln, they say, well, look what he's done. He's freed the slaves where he has no power to actually free them, and he's kept them in bondage where he could have made them free. But a Boston newspaper had it about right. It wrote, "Whatever partial reverses may attend the proclamation's progress, slavery from this hour ceases to be a political power in the country. Such a righteous revolution as the proclamation inaugurates never goes backward." But the war does go forward. And that takes me to the Battle of Gettysburg, and I will give you the quick story of the Battle of Gettysburg. so you can do useful work this afternoon. Anyway, Lee, in the summer of 1863, Lee decides to attack Pennsylvania. Why? He thinks that the North is at a tipping point. They won Antietam, but they've had a lot of defeats, and a lot of debt. It's very expensive. He thinks that if he attacks Pennsylvania, which then truly was the Keystone State, captures Harrisburg, or maybe turns south and menaces Baltimore, or even Washington, that may drive the Union out, may tip them. There's also some desperation to it. The North is more populous, industrial. It's gearing up now on a war footing. Lee knows that the South cannot survive a war of attrition. And also, though the Emancipation Proclamation made it more difficult, oh, that was so frustrating for British politicians, anxious to come in and smack the United States when they themselves had freed their slaves, and the people of Great Britain were just ballyhooing about the Emancipation Proclamation, made it so tough on them. But Lee did think that perhaps if he wins a big victory in the North, that finally Britain and France will recognize the Confederacy and perhaps intervene. After all, French troops are then in Mexico, where they will soon put Emperor Maximilian I, an Austrian archduke, on the throne as the Emperor of Mexico. Well, as Lee moves north, the Union Army stays between Lee and Washington, D.C., because they don't know what he's up to, and of course they want to protect Washington. The armies really accidentally meet at Gettysburg. In those days, the cavalry were the eyes of the army. And the Union cavalry, a brigade under General Buford, Buford goes to the Lutheran Seminary at Gettysburg, goes up to the cupola, which still stands. You can see it today. He looks out to the Chambersburg Pike. He sees Heth's Confederate division marching up the pike toward Gettysburg. They've been told there were shoes in Gettysburg. You know, most of these Confederates walked from the South barefoot. But he thinks they think there might be shoes there. They're coming up the Chambersburg Pike. Buford instantly looks at the ground. It looks favorable. He dismounts his soldiers, and they engage the Heth's division. Heth, of course, calls up reinforcements. Buford sends a messenger to the nearby, to General Reynolds, who commands the nearby Union First Corps, saying, "Come quick, we've engaged them." Reynolds and his men come with a hurry. The Confederates come, and the long and short of it is, on the first day, north and west of town, units, not the whole armies, come together. Eventually, the Confederates overwhelm the Union forces. They can get there quicker. By the way, it's easy to get to Gettysburg because there are all of these roads that lead into Gettysburg. There are 10 of them. The Carlisle Road, the Harrisburg Road, the York Pike, the Hanover Road, the Baltimore Pike, the Taneytown Road, the Emmitsburg Road, the Fairfield Road, the Chambersburg Pike, and the Mummasburg Pike. All these head into Gettysburg, and the armies are scattered around, so they can get there quick, and they do get there quick. The Confederates get there in greater numbers on the first day. They drive the Union Army through Gettysburg. The Union Army takes up its position on Culp's and Cemetery Hill. General Ewell, who is the Corps commander for the Confederates on the scene, then makes a big mistake. It's getting toward nighttime. Ewell lets the Union Army retain the high ground in Culp's Hill. During the night, the armies come up, most of them on either side, and the next day, on July the 2nd, the armies are in the famous fishhook position, with the Union Army right on Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill, circling around and then extending south out along Cemetery Ridge out to Little Round Top and Big Round Top. Lee's strategy on the second day is to have Longstreet attack on the Union left and Ewell on the Union right. At the same time, envelope the Union Army, send them either running or capture a bunch of them. But this is to happen at the same time, and the coordination gets all messed up. And you know, you don't have radios and things. You're waving flags at each other and sounding signal guns and everything. It gets it all mixed up. Well, Longstreet attacks first, not till toward the end of the day, but he finally does. Severe fighting around Little Round Top. Little Round Top, believe it or not, had been abandoned by the Union troops except for one artillery battery. The Union Chief Engineer Gouverneur K. Warren goes up there, doesn't see anybody except this artillery battery. He looks down below, and there seems to be movement in the woods down there. He orders them to fire a shell into the woods, and he sees all the bayonets, moving and the glints off the sun. Gouverneur K., this general, runs literally down and again gets 2 brigades under Strong Vincent, and a guy named O'Rourke. They do the double quick up the hill. They get to the top of the hill as the Confederates are coming up below. Big fight. If you've seen the movie Gettysburg, you've read about the 20th of Maine, part of a regiment in Vincent's brigade. They're way out in the woods on the left. They turn back multiple attacks, finally do a bayonet charge when they're out of ammunition. But the long and short of it holds, they hold Little Round Top. That's key. General Daniel Sickles, another Union commander, I think of the 3rd Corps, he's a political general. He doesn't like where he is in the middle of the high ground, so he decides to go out into the wheat field and the peach orchard where his troops are decimated by Longstreet's men, leaving a big hole in the Union line. The Confederates try to exploit that with one of their brigades. The only outfit there is the 1st Minnesota, a depleted regiment with 240 people. And they are ordered to charge the oncoming Confederates, who outnumber them 10 to 1. They do it, and the shock of it provides enough time for General Winfield Scott Hancock, the Union general on the scene, to plug the hole. But the 1st Minnesota will suffer over 80% casualties in the process. Well, the Union left is saved. On the right, the attack doesn't begin till evening. The Confederates don't succeed there. Lee has missed the opportunity again on July 2nd. July 3rd comes, and that's, of course, the day of Pickett's charge, at the time called Longstreet's Assault. Lee just was convinced the Union troops would run again, as they have time and time again in the face of the rebel yell. But it's a mile from Seminary Ridge to Cemetery Ridge where the Union troops are. He's got some fresh troops, Pickett's division, and he has a couple other divisions. First, it's preceded by a huge cannonade, the largest ever, they say, on the North American continent by the Confederates. They overshot, and they drove all the stragglers up into the Union line, so it didn't do a lot of good. But anyway, after the end of they couldn't see, with all that smoke, and you can't see where you should. Then 15,000 Confederates troops, a mile long from end to end, emerge from the woods and march a mile into the face of fire when they got a little further, closer to the lines, trying to attack the Union center. And there's fierce fighting in places called the Angle, the Copse of Trees, which is now called the high water mark of the Confederacy. I won't go into it, but if you ever go to Gettysburg, spend some time there and just get a sense of what it was like. The Union line almost does falter, but it doesn't at the end. The Confederates retreat, some of them walking backwards lest they suffer the infamy of being shot in the back. They go back to where they came from. July 4th dawns. It's a rainy day. Lee has lost a third of his men, killed, wounded, or missing. He has to retreat. It's a victory for the North. Also on July 4th, Vicksburg falls to the Union, to Grant, and now the entire Mississippi is in the control of the Union. Those days, July 3rd and 4th, really spelled the end of the Confederacy, though the war would go on for a couple of years. And now we get to the Gettysburg Address, which I'll go through very quickly. But when Meade, General George Gordon Meade was Union commander, when he marched his troops after Lee in a somewhat desultory fashion, wired Washington, "I cannot delay to pick up the debris of the battlefield." Well, the debris of the battlefield consisted of, among other things, about 5,000 dead horses and mules, thousands of wounded. Meade did leave behind 100 medical officers. Over 37,000 rifles littered the field, many of them loaded, some with multiple charges. But of course, most important of all, there were 8,000 dead soldiers on the field, both Union and Confederate. It was left largely up to Gettysburg residents to cope with it. It's July, it's hot. You can imagine just exactly what it was like with all that mass of animal and human flesh in the sun. What they did first with the bodies is bury them very shallow graves where they had a name, and they didn't. There were no dog tags at that time. They would post a board by the head and scribble something on it, a name. But they couldn't dig very deep. It was very quick. And families started to come to the battlefield, rummaging around to try and find loved ones. And it was so that people kept getting uncovered, and it was a very bad situation. Gettysburg banker David Wills writes to the Pennsylvania Governor Curtin, In many instances, arms, legs, and sometimes heads protrude, and my attention has gotten to several places where hogs were actually rooting out the bodies and devouring them. Well, obviously, this cannot be permitted to go on. Long and the short of it is, land is acquired for a cemetery. Mr. Wills is put in charge by Governor Curtin. Commission is formed. They hire an architect to design the what was to be the Soldiers' Cemetery. A contract is hired to move the Union dead, not the Confederates, the Union dead at $1.59 per body to the new cemetery. The War Department contributes thousands of caskets, and they plan a dedication. The principal speaker will be Edward Everett of Massachusetts. He's 69 years old, former congressman, senator, president of Harvard, ambassador of the United Kingdom, briefly Secretary of State under Millard Fillmore, an ardent unionist, and a much sought-after public speaker. Now, in those days, public speaking was, people expected a humdinger. I mean, you just didn't, it's not like today where, 10 minutes into the State of the Union, you're ready to watch basketball or something. I mean, they expected something that would be a real show. And they invited, and Edward Everett was just known to be the person who could do that thing. Incidentally, there are no Iowa units designated as having soldiers buried at Gettysburg because the Iowa boys were mostly over at Vicksburg. Now, because it's going to be a big deal, Governor Curtin decides to invite cabinet members, prominent congressmen, etc. And on a visit to Washington, he stops by and sees President Lincoln and asks him if he'd like to come. And Lincoln said, well, sure, I'll be happy to. Now, though Everett was invited months before, because he said he needed months to write up his big speech, Lincoln was not invited to speak until Mr. Wills, who was coordinating things, sent a letter to Lincoln on November 2nd, 1863, 17 days before the dedication of the cemetery, in which he asked Lincoln to give, quote, a few appropriate remarks, close quote. Well, Lincoln delivered. He left Washington by train on the 18th. His wife, Mary Lincoln, did not want him to leave. Tad was sick. The Lincolns were still recovering from the death of their son, Willie, but Lincoln had some things he wanted to say, and he went by train. He arrived in Gettysburg the evening of the 18th. He occupied a bedroom in the Wills house, which if you go to Gettysburg, you can still see. And in the square, he works on his remarks. He goes over, he sees Seward, who's there, that also to go over them with him. The next morning, the 19th, they held these marshals. They were organizing a parade. They couldn't get the thing organized. I mean, the horses were everywhere. The band member, the Marine Guard was horsing around. It took forever to get everybody organized, but they gave Lincoln a bay horse to ride on up to the cemetery from downtown. And he's sitting on his horse, and he gets a telegram from Secretary of War Stanton, which says simply, Tad is better. So Lincoln's mind is put to rest as it relates to that. Finally, about an hour late, they get going with bands and marching. They go up Baltimore Street up to Cemetery Hill. Along the way, a mother hands a young little girl up to Lincoln to ride on his horse. And Lincoln puts the girl on the horse with him, and they go along for a while, and he gives the girl a kiss on her forehead, hands the girl back to a delighted mother. I mean, you could do things at that day and age like that. Well, they're late getting up there. Everett isn't to be found. He had asked for a tent to be put up for him because he wanted to compose himself before the thing. But also he had, he was 69, and as they delicately said, had kidney issues. And so he wanted not only to compose himself, but perhaps take care of nature. And unfortunately, when he got in the tent, he found it had been taken over by a bunch of women, which of course defeated his purpose in having the tent, so things got delayed and delayed and delayed. But finally they get going. About 9,000 people are gathered there. Everett delivers just a humdinger. It lasts 2 hours, and it just, well, you'll get it. Here's how his speech begins. Standing beneath this serene sky, overlooking these broad fields now reposing from the labors of the waning year, the mighty Alleghanies dimly towering before us, the graves of our brethren beneath our feet, it is with hesitation that I raise my poor voice to break the eloquent silence of God and nature. But the duty to which you have called me must be performed. Grant me, I pray, your indulgence and your sympathy. Then he continues, it was anointed by the law of Athens that the obsequies of the citizens who fell in battle should be performed at the public expense in the most honorable manner. Their bones were carefully gathered, on and on. So you can tell what kind of speech they were in for. But it was, he delivered. And he wrote the whole thing out, and he memorized it. He would ostentatiously set the speech out on the thing, on the lectern, and then would never look at it. This was his way of doing things. Well, everybody loved it. Then there's the Baltimore Glee Club sang a song, or some sort of dirge that had been prepared for the occasion. Then President Lincoln is introduced. He rises. He's not memorized his speech. He pulls it from his pocket. He puts on his wire-rimmed spectacles. There's silence. And here's what Lincoln said. 87 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. We are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that our nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note, nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work, which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Lincoln finished, and there's silence. And Lincoln thinks the crowd is disappointed. And what they really think is, okay, we have just gotten settled in. But, and then there's polite applause, but Lincoln, he talked for just 2 minutes, and he's disappointed. He whispers to his friend and sometime bodyguard Ward Lamon that the speech did not scour. That's an old farming term. When a plow doesn't dig in, it doesn't scour. Secretary Seward thought it was a failure, unworthy of Lincoln. And there were predictable reactions from the press. Those who liked Lincoln liked the speech. Those who did not like the speech. But it wasn't long before the importance of the speech and what Lincoln actually said began to be appreciated. In fact, the next day, a letter arrived at the White House from Edward Everett, the main speaker. He told President Lincoln, and I quote, "I should be glad if I could flatter myself that I came as near to the central idea of the occasion in 2 hours as you did in 2 minutes." Well, in analyzing Lincoln's address, it's important to begin by noting what he did not say. He did not talk of victory. That word is not mentioned. He did not mention the North. He did not mention the South. He did not mention the Union. He did not mention the Confederacy. He did not refer to slavery. He did not talk about the course of battle. No persons, no heroes are mentioned by name, no generals, no congratulations are handed out. What he does say is the broader view of what he viewed the war was all about. He begins by saying the founding fathers created a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. And now the nation's survival is threatened by civil war. Lincoln goes on to say, and he had said this before, in fact, he had told one of his private secretaries, John Hay, early in the war, that, I quote, "The central idea pervading this struggle is the necessity that it is upon us of proving that popular government is not an absurdity. If we fail, it will go far to prove the incapability of the people to govern themselves." And you know, the United States was very much an experiment when it was formed, and it still was. There weren't democracies like that where the people actually were expected to rule. And we were in this great struggle created by slavery, and the issue was, would the country survive? So Lincoln tells the country, we're here to dedicate a resting place for those soldiers who fought here so that our nation might live. He points out the obvious, that we can't do any in our words any more than they did. But rather, he said, it's for us to finish the work that these honored dead gave themselves for in their sacrifice. Then he ends by saying that the nation will have a new birth of freedom. The government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from the earth. That's the whole purpose of the Civil War as Lincoln sees it. Now, Lincoln, of course, did not expressly mention slavery. But the Emancipation Proclamation, you can see, and this continuum comes into it. You know, at the very beginning, he refers to the country as, you know, being created, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. And he ends by saying that the purpose of the war is to bring about a new birth of freedom. He has his thinking about the war and what he is doing and the end of slavery and all of this has gotten to this point. Well, I'm almost done, you'll be glad to know. In 1863, 150 years ago, was a very important year in our nation's history. It began with the Emancipation Proclamation. In mid-year, it saw the triumphs of Gettysburg and Vicksburg, which signaled that the nation, the Union, would indeed survive. It ends with the Gettysburg Address, in which Lincoln tells the country that what the war is really about, a new birth of freedom. In a real sense, to me, 1863 saw the birth of our nation as it is today. Before then, people would say the United States are this or that. After the Civil War, they would say the United States is. It became singular and no longer plural. The Pledge of Allegiance has been modified a number of times since it was first composed in 1892, but one part, which aptly describes the significance of 1863 and the Civil War in general, has never changed. As Lincoln hoped, the country emerged from the Civil War, quote, one nation indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Now, of course, the liberty and justice part of that took a little more doing to get accomplished. And the struggle, that's what the struggle for civil rights has been all about in the 150 years since, and of course, in varying degrees, goes on today. But I'll leave that for next month's presentation, when I understand Judge Ramonda Belcher will talk to the Polk County Bar about realizing the dream of equality for all. But 1863 is a good year to remember for us. It was a good year for the United States. Thank you for inviting me to do this.